The morning Garrett told me I had 4 weeks to leave the house I had lived in for 27 years, the only sound in the kitchen was the kettle starting to whistle. He had driven up from Boston the night before and slept in the guest room. He had not called ahead to say he was coming. He stood in his charcoal wool coat by the breakfast bar with a manila envelope under his arm, and he waited for me to make the tea before he said what he had come to say. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He was 54 years old. I had known him since he was 27, since the first dinner Walter had brought me to meet his only child, on a Saturday evening at a restaurant in Burlington that no longer existed. Garrett had been polite that night. He had been polite at our wedding 2 years later. He had been polite at his father's 70th birthday party. He had been polite at the hospital the morning Walter died. He was always polite. That was the thing about Garrett. Politeness in his hands was a thing he could use the way other people use silence or money or a closed door. He had learned it from his mother, Walter had told me once, with the small sideways smile he used when he was admitting something he hadn't quite meant to admit. Walter's first wife had died of a brain aneurysm in 1989 when Garrett was 20. Walter and I had met in 1994. We had married in 1996. None of those numbers taken together had ever been quite enough to make Garrett think of me as anything other than the woman his father had married after his mother. That was the kindest reading of how he saw me. The less kind reading I had been working on letting go of for 27 years. I set down the teapot on the slate trivet Walter had bought for me at a craft fair in Stowe in 1998. I poured a cup for Garrett. I poured a cup for myself. I sat down at the long pine table where Walter and I had eaten our breakfasts every morning of our marriage and I waited. Garrett did not sit. He took the manila envelope from under his arm and laid it flat on the table between us. Then he tapped it twice with one finger, the way a man taps a court file before he begins his argument. "June," he said, "I think the time has come for us to have a conversation we should have had a year ago. My name is June Hadley. I was born June Lieberman in 1955, in a small house outside Brattleboro, Vermont, to a mother who had emigrated from Germany as a small child in 1932, and a father who had grown up on a dairy farm in the Northeast Kingdom. My mother's family had been the only ones from her line who had come to America. The rest had stayed. The rest had not survived. I grew up understanding, in the careful indirect way that children of survivors and almost survivors understand things, that the past was something my mother carried in a closed compartment of herself that she did not open in front of me. She was kind. She was steady. She did not talk about Germany. When she died in 1992, I went through her dresser drawer looking for the things I knew she had kept and found a small lacquer box of photographs and one letter in German that I could not read and which I had translated, eventually, by a woman at the library in Burlington, and which turned out to be a letter from her older sister Hannah confirming her safe arrival in America in October of 1932. There had been a younger sister too. Her name was in the letter. I had heard the name once or twice in my childhood and never again. Esther. I tell you this not because it is the point of the story, but because it will become the point of the story, although neither I nor Garrett nor anyone else in the world knew that on the morning he stood in my kitchen with the manila envelope. I had spent my working life as a school librarian, 38 years at the Northbridge Consolidated School, a brick building 3 blocks off the village green, with one good window in the children's reading area that faced the maples, and a heating system that knocked in the winter the way old radiators knock when they are doing their best. I had retired in 2018. I had been married to Walter Hadley for 22 of those working years and for 5 years after retirement, and the 5 retirement years had been the ones I had been looking forward to my whole working life. We had planned a garden. We had planned a small trip to Quebec City, which we had managed to take in the spring of 2019. We had planned, in the loose hopeful way that people plan, to grow old together in the farmhouse on Ashfield Road that had been in Walter's family since 1923, and which Walter had inherited from his own father in 1981. In June of 2021, Walter was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He died on the 2nd of October that same year. For months. That was how long we had between the diagnosis and the morning the hospice nurse called me out of the recliner where I had finally fallen asleep at 5 in the morning, to tell me he was gone. I will spare you most of the next 6 months. I do not want to write them down. I sat in that house with the wrong kind of quiet around me, and I sorted through Walter's papers, and I answered the phone when it rang, and I made small dinners I did not eat. Garrett came up from Boston twice in that period. He brought a casserole the first time. He brought, the second time, a folder of bank statements his father had kept in a drawer in the study, which he wanted to take back to Boston to review. I let him take them. I did not ask why he needed them. I was not in a state then to ask. The will was read in November of 2021. Walter had used a lawyer in town named Howard Pelham, whose office was above the diner on Main Street and who had handled Walter's father's affairs and Walter's affairs, and most of the affairs of most of the older families in the county. The will was straightforward. The house on Ashfield Road and the half-acre lot it sat on were to remain Walter's property, transferred upon his death into a small living trust, with provisions for me to remain in residence and for the property to pass, eventually, to Garrett. The remainder of Walter's savings, approximately $40,000, was left to me. There were small bequests to a cousin and to the Northbridge Volunteer Fire Department. Howard read it through with the slow, careful voice he used for these readings, and he looked at me when he was finished and he said, in the small, kind way of a country attorney, "He took care of you, June. Just the way he said he would." I believed it. I had no reason not to. I lived in the house for the next 3 years. I tended the garden. I paid the property taxes out of the small annuity Walter had left me and out of my Social Security, and the pension from the school district. I had thought I was managing. I had thought, in the careful way of a woman who had been raised by careful people, that I was doing it right. Garrett came up twice a year, usually around the holidays. He was always polite. He always asked how I was managing the property. He always commented on the things that needed attention: the gutters, the roof, the fence along the east side, in the tone of a man who was making mental notes, although I did not understand then what the notes were for. In September of 2024, 3 years almost to the day after Walter died, Garrett came up on a Thursday evening without warning, and he slept in the guest room, and in the morning he stood in my kitchen with a manila envelope and he said, "June, I think the time has come for us to have a conversation we should have had a year ago." Inside the manila envelope was a document. It was a document Walter had signed in 2003. It was, Garrett explained in the same calm, reasonable voice he used to explain commercial real estate financing to his clients, a supplementary deed transfer that Walter had executed in conjunction with the original deed and the trust. Clarified, Garrett said, the intent of the trust. It established that I would have the right to reside in the property for a period of 3 years following Walter's death, after which the property would transfer outright to Garrett. The transfer date, he said, with one finger again resting on the document, was 30 days away. I did not say anything for a long time. Garrett did not fill the silence. Garrett was good at silence. Garrett was, I understood in that moment, a man who had been carrying this conversation in his pocket for 3 years, waiting for the day the calendar reached the right square. "Why did you not tell me about this earlier?" I said finally. He looked at me with the small, patient expression of a man explaining the obvious. "Because you had 3 years," he said. "And because I wanted you to have those years without it hanging over you. I think you would agree that was the Kinder way." The Kinder way. He said it as though kindness were a thing he had been measuring out, in careful spoonfuls, for 3 years. "Walter never told me about this," I said. "He may have intended to," Garrett said. "He may have meant to bring it up at some point and not gotten the chance. I can't speak to his intentions. I can only speak to what he signed. And what he signed is what we have." I looked at the document. The signature was Walter's. It was the slightly tilted, slightly hurried signature I had seen him put on checks and birthday cards and insurance forms for 27 years. I knew it the way you know a person's footstep on the stairs. "I would like to have my lawyer look at this," I said. "Of course," Garrett said. "I would expect that. I think you will find it is what it appears to be. But please by all means have it reviewed. I will leave you a copy. The original will stay with my attorney in Boston." He took out a second envelope, a smaller one, and laid the copy on the table. Then he picked up his cup of tea, which he had not yet touched, and he said, "I am sorry that we have to have this conversation, June. I know it is not what you were expecting, but I want to be fair. 4 weeks is more than I am legally required to give you. I want to be sure you have time to find an arrangement that works for you." He drank his tea. He set the cup down. He picked up his coat, although he had not taken it off. He said he would be back at the end of the month with a moving company if I needed help. He said he hoped we could handle this respectfully. He said he was sure his father would have wanted that. Then he walked out of my kitchen and got into his black SUV in the driveway and drove back to Boston, and I sat at the long pine table with the manila envelope in front of me and a cup of tea I could not drink, and I understood for the first time in my life that the past 27 years had been, in some way I was only now beginning to see, a long quiet arrangement that I had been the last person in the room to learn the terms of. I took the document to a lawyer in town named Carol Brennan, whose office was on the second floor of the old bank building on Maple Street. I had known Carol slightly for years from the school library days. Her 2 daughters had been students of mine. She was 61 years old, a small woman with white hair cut short, and she read the document in front of me with the careful attention of a person who had read a great many documents of this kind and had stopped being surprised by what people put on paper. When she was done, she set it down and folded her hands. "June," she said, "I am sorry to tell you this. The document is properly executed. The signature is notarized. It was filed with the county clerk's office in 2003, 21 years ago. There is a recording stamp. It is what Garrett says it is." I had not realized until that moment how much of me had still been hoping it was a forgery. I had been carrying that hope quietly all the way through Carol's review. I felt it leave me the way you feel a low fever break. "Can I fight it?" I said. Carol looked at me and she did not pretend. "You can challenge anything in court," she said. "But June, I have to be honest with you. The document is properly drawn. The recording is on file. Walter's intent is clearly stated. To challenge it successfully, you would have to argue either undue influence at the time of signing, which is a very high bar 21 years later, or some kind of fraud, which is not what this is. You would be looking at $30,000 to $50,000 in legal fees minimum, with a very low chance of success. And during that process, you would still be required to vacate. The trust controls the property until and unless a court orders otherwise." I sat with that for a moment. "What did Walter give Garrett to do this?" I said. Carol's eyes softened. "I don't know," she said. "And I don't think we can know. He may have done it because Garrett pressured him at a difficult time. He may have done it because he genuinely thought the 3 years would be enough for you to settle yourself elsewhere, and he didn't want to burden you with the conversation. He may have done it because Garrett's mother had certain wishes about the family property that Walter had agreed to honor, and he assumed you would understand. There are many reasons men do things, June. Some of them are not as kind as we want them to be." She paused. Then she said, more quietly, "What I can tell you is that he left you $40,000 in his will, and he carried life insurance that he could have made you the beneficiary of, and he did not. That is information you should have." I did not know about the life insurance. I would learn in the days that followed that there had been a policy worth $120,000, and that Walter had kept Garrett as the beneficiary for the entirety of our marriage, never updating it. I went home from Carol's office and I walked through the house slowly, room by room, and I tried to understand what I was looking at. The house had been Walter's family home since 1923. It had been the house I had moved into in 1996, with my single suitcase and the small set of books from my apartment in Burlington, which Walter had teased me about the day I unpacked them, because they took up only 1 shelf and a half. It was the house where we had eaten breakfast together every morning for 25 years. It was the house where I had sat with him in the front parlor in the last weeks of his life and read to him from a book of essays by E.B. White, which he had said he wanted to hear again, because they had been his father's favorites. It was not, in the legal sense, my house. It had never been my house. I sat down in Walter's old chair in the parlor. I looked at the photograph on the mantel of the 2 of us at his sister's wedding in 2010. I looked at the small wooden bowl on the side table that I had bought at the craft fair in Burlington in our 2nd year of marriage. I looked at the rug we had picked out together at a barn sale in 2007. I looked at the curtains I had sewn from a fabric Walter had brought home from a trip to Maine in 2014. I had thought I was building a home. I had been, in some way I had not understood, decorating someone else's. I want to be careful about what I say here, because I do not want to make Walter into a villain. He was not. He was a good and kind and limited man who loved me in his way and who failed me in the way that good and kind and limited men sometimes fail their wives, which is by not having the difficult conversations because he could not bear to. He had loved his first wife. He had loved Garrett. He had carried his loyalty to them in a compartment of himself that I had been allowed near but not into. I had known that. I had accepted it. I had not known how much of his life I was not, in his arrangements, fully a part of. I had 4 weeks. I made a list on a piece of lined paper at the kitchen table of the things I owned in the world. The $40,000 Walter had left me had been spent on Walter. $25,000 had gone to the hospital bills Medicare did not cover. $3,000 had gone to the funeral. $2,000 had gone to a new furnace the winter after he died because the old one had finally failed. The rest had gone, in small careful pieces, to property taxes I had not realized were mine to pay, and to a roof repair, and to keeping the house in a state Walter would have wanted me to keep it in, even though I now understood I had been keeping it for Garrett the whole time. I had $18,000 in the savings account at the credit union. I had my Social Security check, which after Medicare came to about $1,400 a month. I had my pension from the school district, which after taxes came to about $800 a month. I had my car, a 2014 Subaru with 112,000 miles on it. I had the things in the house that were mine in the sense that I had brought them with me or had bought them with my own money, although it would turn out to be harder to separate those from the things that were Walter's than I had expected, because 27 years of marriage is a long time to disentangle. That was the list. A woman could live on those resources. A woman could not, in Vermont, buy a house with them. A woman could rent a small apartment for around $1,500 a month before utilities, which was approximately what my combined Social Security and pension were after taxes, which meant she could not eat. Which meant she would be drawing down the $18,000 at a rate that would empty the account in less than a year. I sat with that for a long time too. Then I called my oldest friend in town, a woman named Marjorie Pell, who had retired from the town clerk's office 4 years before but who still worked 1 day a week filing paperwork because Beatrice Lyle, the current town clerk, was not yet 60 and Marjorie was not yet ready to stop being useful. Marjorie had known me for 35 years. She had known Walter longer. I told her on the phone in the short careful way that people tell hard things to old friends what had happened. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Marjorie said, in the voice of a woman who was already mentally rearranging her morning, "I will be at your house in 20 minutes. Put the kettle on." She came. She drank 2 cups of tea. She listened. She did not say the things people sometimes say when they hear about a friend's bad situation, the small useless reassurances. She listened until I was done. Then she said, "All right. Tell me what you have decided to do." I had not decided anything. "I am thinking I will rent something in town," I said. "Until I figure it out." Marjorie shook her head once. "There is nothing to rent in town under $1,600 a month," she said. "I know because Beatrice's daughter has been looking for 6 months. You will spend your $18,000 in a year, and then you will be in a worse place than you are now." "I do not know what else to do," I said. Marjorie looked at me across the table. She had pale blue eyes and a way of looking at a person that made the person feel both seen and gently corrected, the way the best librarians look at students who are about to make an error. "June," she said, "there is a tax sale on the 18th. I looked at her. "A tax sale," I said. "The county has 13 properties on the rolls this year that nobody has wanted for so long the county just wants them off. Most of them are buildable lots out by the highway. Some of them have small structures on them. The minimum bid is $1, plus a recording fee, plus the cost of the deed transfer. Total, you are looking at maybe $20 to take possession of a piece of land." "Land that nobody wants," I said. "Land that nobody has wanted yet," Marjorie said. "Sometimes those are the same. Sometimes they are not." She paused. Then she said, "I want you to come down to the office tomorrow morning. I want to show you the list. Some of these properties are nothing, June. Brush lots, swampy bits, the kind of place where you could not even pitch a tent. But some of them have things on them. There is one in particular I have been thinking about since you called me." "Which one?" I said. "There is a piece on Old Mill Road," she said. "A half-acre with an ice house on it. The ice house is from 1898. It was the cold storage for the Goss estate before the estate got broken up in the 1940s. The Goss family hung on to the icehouse parcel until 1983, and then let it lapse. Since then nobody has done anything with it. The county has been carrying it for 41 years. They want it gone. An icehouse, I said. An icehouse, Marjorie said. I had passed Old Mill Road many times. It was a small road that branched off the county road just east of town, and it ran out past 2 farms and a Christmas tree lot and a dirt pull-off where teenagers parked in the summer. I did not remember an icehouse, but I had not been looking for one. What kind of shape is it in? I said. I do not know exactly, Marjorie said. Beatrice and I drove past it last spring when we were updating the photos in the rolls. The roof has lost some shingles. There is brush grown up around it. The walls are stone and look solid. There is no septic and no well and no power. You could not, June, just move into it. You would have to put work into it. But it is a structure. It is a roof and walls. And the half-acre is buildable. You could put a trailer on it later if you needed to. You could put up a small cabin. You could sell it eventually. The land alone, once it is cleared off the tax rolls, is worth 30 or 40,000. And the minimum bid, I said. $3, Marjorie said. The county rounds up small parcels to 3 for the recording, plus a $30 deed transfer fee. Plus you would owe nothing on the back taxes because the county absorbs them at this stage. They write it off in exchange for getting the parcel back on the productive rolls. I looked at her. Marjorie, I said. I know, she said. You are telling me I could buy an icehouse for $3. I am telling you, Marjorie said, that the county would write you a deed for $33.40 to take a half-acre of land with a stone building on it that nobody else has wanted for 41 years. I am also telling you that you do not have many other moves, June. And I am telling you that I would rather see you walk into a tax sale and walk out with a deed than see you spend down everything you have on a one-bedroom apartment that does not allow you to build anything. I went home that night and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time and I tried to think about it clearly. A part of me felt foolish even considering it. An icehouse. From 1898. With no power and no water and a leaking roof, on a piece of land that nobody had wanted in 40 years. The kind of thing the women I had worked with at the library would call a project, with a small downward look that meant they did not approve. The kind of thing Garrett would call, when he heard about it, a sad little arrangement. But another part of me, a quieter part, was already turning it over. Stone walls. A roof even if it leaked. A piece of land that would be mine, not held in a trust, not subject to a supplementary deed, not waiting for the day a stepson stood in my kitchen with a manila envelope. Mine in the simple legal sense that the property would have my name on the deed. I had spent 27 years living in someone else's house and not understanding what that meant. I was not interested in spending whatever years I had left doing it again. Even if the alternative was an icehouse from 1898. I went to the town clerk's office on Friday morning. Marjorie was at the front desk. She nodded at me once and turned and pulled a folder out of the cabinet behind her. Here is what I have, she said. The folder had 4 photographs of the property, taken in different seasons. There was a summer photograph showing the icehouse from the road, half hidden behind a clump of staghorn sumac. There was a fall photograph showing it from the back with the brush down. There was a winter photograph with snow piled up against the north wall. There was a spring photograph taken from the air by some county survey done in 2019, showing the half-acre as a small irregular square cut out of the surrounding farmland. The icehouse was a small stone building, roughly 20 by 30 feet. A pitched shingle roof with a section missing along the east slope. A single door on the south side. One window high up on the west wall. No other openings. The walls looked, from the photographs, to be remarkably intact for a building that had been left alone for 4 decades. The stone was a local gray granite. The mortar between the courses was visible but did not look failed. The roof was the problem. The roof was almost certainly going to need to be replaced. What is the inside like? I said. I have not been inside, Marjorie said. Beatrice has not been inside. I have asked. The county does not enter properties on the tax rolls. They photograph the exterior and they record what they can see. I would assume the inside is in the condition you would expect after 41 years of no maintenance and a roof that has been leaking for at least the last 10. So I would be bidding on something I have not seen. You would be bidding on a stone building with a roof problem on a half-acre of land. The land you can see. The building you can see from the outside. What is inside is whatever is inside. June, it is $3. If the inside is uninhabitable, you have lost $3. I went out to Old Mill Road that same afternoon. I drove slowly. I watched the mailbox numbers. The parcel was at the end of a short dirt track that branched off the road just past a Christmas tree lot. I parked at the entrance to the track because I did not want to drive over what I could not see, and I walked the last 50 yards on foot. The ice house came into view through the staghorn sumac. I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that moment because the feeling surprised me. I felt at home. I do not mean that in the soft way that people use that phrase. I mean it in the small specific way of a woman who has been looking for a long time for something to take up the weight of her own life, and who recognizes in the moment she sees it, that this thing might be it. The stone was beautiful. The walls were squarer than I had expected from the photographs, and the local granite had the particular silver gray color it gets in mid-afternoon September light. The door was the original oak door, weathered to a soft brown, fitted into a stone frame with the kind of craft that 19th-century country masons brought to small buildings without thinking of it as craft. The roof, the part that was still there, was made of split cedar shakes that had moss on them but still looked like they meant business. The missing section of roof was on the east side and looked like it had come off in pieces over several winters. You could see into the building through it but only into the rafters, not into the floor. I walked all the way around it. The brush had grown up against the walls, but the walls themselves were sound. I put my hand against the south wall and the stone was cold and steady against my palm. The wall did not move when I leaned on it. The wall had not moved, I understood, in 126 years. It would not move because Garrett came back from Boston in 3 weeks with a moving company. I tried the door. It was locked, in the loose sense that the door had a hasp and a heavy iron padlock on it. The padlock was old. The hasp was old. I did not have a key. I did not yet have any right to be there. I walked the half-acre. The land sloped gently toward a small swale at the back that probably ran wet in spring. There were 2 old apple trees at the edge of the property, gone wild but still bearing small fruit that was lying scattered in the grass. There was a stone foundation visible behind the ice house, 20 feet square, the remains of a cottage that had been there before. There was no cottage anymore. There was just the foundation and a single brick chimney standing up out of it, 2 stories tall, with the iron stovepipe still in place. The cottage had belonged to someone once before the someone left. I stood at the back of the property and looked across at the ice house in the late afternoon September sun. The light was the particular kind of gold that Vermont light gets in early fall. The maples behind the property were just beginning to turn at their tops. I went back to my car. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table and I made a second list on the same piece of lined paper. Roof. Probably $15,000 for a basic shingle replacement. More if anything underneath needed to be repaired. Door and window repairs. Some kind of interior wall finish. A wood stove and a chimney run-through. A composting toilet at least at first and a water solution which would have to be either a hauled tank or eventually a drilled well. Solar panels maybe. A small generator at minimum. An insulated platform inside the existing stone shell. Possibly with a sleeping loft if the height allowed. I added up rough numbers. $25,000 on the high end if I did most of it carefully and slowly, hired a roofer and a carpenter for the key pieces, and did the interior finish myself with help from a friend or two. I had $18,000. It would not be enough, but it would be a start. And the deed would be mine free and clear, and the land would be mine free and clear, and whatever I built inside those stone walls I would be building for myself in my own name with no clause in any document anywhere that said it would pass to someone else after a period of years. I went to the tax sale on the morning of the 18th. It was held in the meeting room at the town hall, a low-ceilinged room with fluorescent lights and metal folding chairs and a podium at the front where Beatrice Lyle, the town clerk, stood with a clipboard. There were maybe 20 people in the room. Most of them, I learned later, were local landowners checking on adjacent parcels that bordered their own, or developers from down the valley looking for buildable lots. There were 2 reporters from the county paper, one of whom I recognized from the school years and who waved at me with the small surprised look of a person who had not expected to see me there. I sat in the 3rd row. Beatrice read through the parcels one at a time. Most of them went without competition, sold to whoever was sitting closest to the file, for $3 plus the recording fees. 2 of them had multiple bidders and went for between $200 and $300, which Beatrice noted with the small mild interest of a woman who had been running these sales for 15 years, and was always quietly pleased when they generated more than the rounding. The ice house parcel was the 9th on the list. Beatrice read out the description. Half-acre, Old Mill Road, parcel number 14 to 227, one stone structure of unknown interior condition. No improvements, no utilities. Minimum bid $3. I raised my hand. Beatrice looked at me. She did not act surprised, although I had not told her I was coming, and Marjorie had not, I knew, told her either, because Marjorie did not gossip about the people she helped. June Hadley, $3, Beatrice said. There was a small silence. The room looked around. Nobody else raised a hand. Going once, Beatrice said. I held still. Going twice. A man in the back row, a developer I did not recognize, raised his hand and called out 5. Beatrice looked at me. I raised my hand again. 6, I said. The developer looked at me too. Then he looked at his clipboard where I assume he had notes on the parcel. Then he looked at the developer next to him and the 2 of them exchanged a small look that I could read from 20 feet away. The look said, no septic, no well, half-acre on a back road, stone shell, why bother? The developer in the back shook his head once at Beatrice. Going once at 6, Beatrice said. Going twice. Sold to June Hadley for $6. I sat in the 3rd row in the fluorescent light and I felt, for the first time in a long time, the small specific lightness of a person who has done a thing they will not have to undo. I went up to the front of the room when Beatrice called my name. I wrote a check for $6 and the recording fee and the deed transfer fee, total $36.40. I signed the paperwork. Beatrice handed me a folder with the deed copy in it, and a key to the padlock on the door, which she had retrieved from a small lockbox in the corner of her office that morning. Congratulations, June, she said in her flat town clerk voice, which was the only voice she ever used, even when she was being kind. Thank you, Beatrice. I walked out into the September sun with the deed in one hand and the key in the other. I drove straight from the town hall to Old Mill Road. I parked at the entrance to the dirt track. I walked the 50 yards. I stood at the door of the ice house. I fitted the key into the padlock. It turned after a small effort, with the heavy reluctant click of a lock that had not been opened in a long time. I lifted the hasp. I pulled open the oak door. A wedge of pale September light fell into the interior, lit a strip of dirt and old straw and something with a curved metal edge that I could not immediately identify, and the rest of the building stayed in its own settled dimness. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was that the air was cooler than the air outside, by a noticeable degree, in the way that thick stone walls make the air cool even on a warm September afternoon. The second thing I noticed was that the floor was not all dirt. The front section, maybe 12 feet deep, was packed earth. The back section, beyond that, was a wood floor, raised on what looked like joists, in fairly remarkable condition for its age, given the leaking roof above us. The third thing I noticed after my eyes had adjusted was that the back section of the building was not open to the rafters. There was an interior wall. The wall ran the full width of the building, about 12 feet back from the door. It was made of vertical pine planks, weathered gray but tight together, with a door set into it. The door was a heavy oak door, smaller than the outer door, set into a wood frame, with a hasp and a chain wrapped through it and a second padlock holding the chain closed. I stood looking at it. Nobody had told me there was an inner room. The county photographs had been taken from the outside. The county records, I would learn later when I went back through them with Marjorie, listed the building as a single-room ice house the way ice houses are usually listed, because that is what ice houses usually are. The interior wall was not on the survey. The interior wall, like the inner door and the second padlock and whatever was on the other side of them, had not been seen by any county employee in 41 years and possibly longer. I had a key to the outer padlock. I did not have a key to the inner one. I stood in the dim cool air with the September light coming in behind me, and I looked at the inner door and I felt, for the second time that day, a small specific feeling that surprised me. It was the feeling of a librarian who has walked into a room of unsorted books and has understood, in the first second, that the room is not what it appears to be from the doorway. The padlock on the inner door was newer than the one on the outer door. Not new, but newer. It looked, in the light from the open door behind me, like the kind of padlock that had been added sometime in the mid-20th century. Sometime, I thought, after the Goss family had stopped using the building for ice. Somebody had used this back room for something. And then somebody had locked it. And then somebody had left and not come back. And the building had passed into the county's hands. And 41 years had gone by. And nobody had ever opened the inner door. I did not try to break the inner padlock that afternoon. I was not, by temperament or training, a person who broke things. I had spent my working life in a building where small careful actions added up to large careful results. And I had learned that whatever was on the other side of a closed door usually waited better than the person trying to open it. I walked the front section of the building instead. There was very little in it. A wooden shelf along the west wall, sagging in the middle, with a row of old galvanized buckets on it that had been used, probably, for hauling water or sawdust at some point in the building's working life. A coil of rusted chain in one corner. A long-handled tool that I eventually identified as an ice tongs, the kind used to grip blocks of ice cut from a pond, lying on the floor near the inner wall as though someone had set it down there and not picked it up. The packed earth floor had a long shallow channel running along its center, which I would learn was a drainage channel cut into the floor when the building was working, to carry off the melt from the ice blocks stacked in the back. The back section, the wood-floored section, was the part that had been the actual cold storage. The thick stone walls and the sawdust insulation that had once been packed between an inner and outer wall surface would have kept ice frozen well into July. The wood floor was an upgrade from later in the building's life, raised on joists to keep the contents off the damp ground. The interior wall with the door in it was not original. Someone had built that wall with care some decades after the building was first constructed. Someone had divided the back section into 2 rooms. Someone had built a smaller secondary space inside the larger one, and had used the existing stone walls of the ice house as the outer shell of their secondary space, and had put a door on it, and had locked the door, and had walked away. I stood looking at that wall for a long time. It was the wall of a person who had wanted a private space. A workshop, maybe. A study. A place to store things they did not want anyone else to see. The wall had been built carefully. The planks fit tightly. The frame around the inner door had been mitered at the corners by someone who knew how to miter a corner. Whoever had built this had cared about the work. I stepped out into the sun. I locked the outer padlock again because the key fitted, and the act of locking the door behind me felt like the act of taking responsibility for what was inside, even though I did not yet know what was inside. I walked back to the car. The September afternoon was cooling toward evening, the slant of light yellowing. I drove back to town and I stopped at Marjorie's house on the way home. She was on her porch reading the paper in a sweater she had owned since the school years. "Tell me," she said when she saw my face. I told her about the inner wall and the inner door and the second padlock that did not match the first. Marjorie set the paper down. "Beatrice did not know there was an inner room," she said, in the small confirming way of a woman thinking out loud. "The survey would have shown it if anyone had been inside. Nobody has been inside in 41 years. At least 41. Probably longer. The Goss family stopped paying taxes on it in 1983, which means they had probably stopped using it for ice well before that. The conversion of the interior is the work of somebody who used the building for something else after the Goss family stopped using it for ice." "Who would that have been?" I said. Marjorie thought about it. She had been the town clerk for 30 years. She had a particular kind of memory for who had lived where, and when, and what they had done. "There was a cottage on that parcel until sometime in the late 70s, she said. "Owner occupied. The cottage came down in a bad ice storm in 1979 or 1980. The family that owned it had passed by then. The land sat empty until the county started carrying it on the tax rolls." "Who lived in the cottage?" "I would have to look it up. I remember an older man. He kept to himself. He was not local. He had come up from out of state sometime after the war. He did woodworking, I think. He sold furniture at the craft fair in Burlington for years." "Do you remember a name?" "Otto something. I want to say Stein. Otto Stein. He died sometime in the early 70s. I would have to check." I drove home with the name Otto Stein in my head, and a feeling I could not yet identify settling into the back of my chest. I had not asked Marjorie for the connection, but she had given it to me anyway, the way good librarians and good town clerks give people information they did not know they needed. That night I sat at the kitchen table on Ashfield Road, which had once felt like my kitchen and which I now understood had never been mine in any way the law would have recognized, and I made a third list in the same notebook I had used for the others. I wrote down everything I would need to bring with me when I left, for weeks from now. I wrote down the things I would not be able to take because they belonged to the house or because I had no place to put them. I wrote down a small careful budget for the next 6 months, and a separate one for the year after, assuming I could spend a portion of the $18,000 on the icehouse roof and still have something to live on through the winter. I wrote down the names of 3 contractors I would need to call, and the name of a man who hauled water, and the name of the propane company, and the name of the electric cooperative who could tell me what it would cost to bring a pole out to the parcel from the line at the road. At the bottom of the page, almost as an afterthought, I wrote bolt cutters. I did not know yet what was behind the inner door. I did not know who had built the wall or what they had stored there, or why they had locked it, or whether they had meant to come back. I knew only that the door existed, and that the key to the outer building was in my coat pocket, and that the deed to the parcel had my name on it, and that whatever was in that small back room was now my responsibility to find and to understand. I would go back, I decided, on Saturday morning. I would bring bolt cutters. I would bring a flashlight and a broom and a pair of work gloves, and the kind of small steady attention that a librarian brings to a room of books that have been sitting in the dark for a long time. I would open the inner door. I would see what was on the other side of it. Whatever it was mine, and it had been waiting, although it did not know it was waiting for me, for longer than I had been alive. It is a strange thing to come into possession of a building, late in your life, that has been keeping a secret you cannot yet see. It is stranger still to come into possession of it on the same week that the life you had thought was yours has been quietly taken back by the family of a husband who could not bring himself to tell you, while he was alive, that the home you shared with him had never, in any document, been yours. I did not sleep much that night. When I did sleep, I slept the way a person sleeps who has, for the first time in a long time, a thing to wake up to. I was at Bennett Hardware on Main Street when it opened at 7. Caleb Bennett, who had taken over the store from his father in 2008, and who had been one of my students at the elementary school library in the late 1990s, looked up from the register when the bell over the door rang. He saw it was me and his face did the small adjustment that happens on the face of a former student, who has just realized he is now serving the woman who used to read to him on a beanbag in the picture book corner. "Mrs. Hadley," he said. "Caleb, you are out early. I have a project." I told him what I needed. A pair of bolt cutters 18 inches if he had them. A good flashlight, the kind with a wide beam. A canvas drop cloth. A heavy-duty broom. A roll of contractor's bags. Work gloves and a medium. A small pry bar. A pencil and a clipboard because I had not thought to bring a notebook from the house. Caleb pulled the items together without asking what the project was, because Caleb had inherited from his father the small good manner of country hardware store proprietors, which is to fill the order in front of them and to let the customer say what they want to say or not say it. He totaled it on the register. $83.40. I paid in cash. He carried the bolt cutters out to the car for me. He set them in the back seat. He stood for a moment with the door open. "You all right, Mrs. Hadley?" he said. Not as a pleasantry. As a question. I looked at him. "I think so," I said. "I will let you know." He nodded. He closed the door. He went back inside. I drove out Old Mill Road in the early morning September light. The mist was rising off the swale at the back of the property as I pulled onto the dirt track. I parked. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. The clipboard and the pencil were on the seat beside me. The bolt cutters were heavy enough that I had to use both hands to lift them out of the car. I walked the 50 yards to the ice house. I unlocked the outer padlock with the key from the town clerk's office. I pulled open the oak door. The morning light fell in behind me, longer and lower than it had been the afternoon before. The interior was dim and cool. The smell of old stone and old wood was unchanged. I stood in the front section for a moment with the bolt cutters in my hand. Then I walked to the inner wall, set down the bolt cutters, took the flashlight from my coat pocket, and turned it on. The beam lit the inner door. Heavy oak, the same wood as the outer door but a smaller frame. The hasp was iron, mounted to the door with 4 square-headed screws. The chain through the hasp was the kind of chain used to secure barn doors, 3/4-inch lengths, blue-black with age. The padlock was a master lock brass body, the kind made in the 1950s or 1960s by the look of it. I crouched and ran the beam over it. The shackle was not rusted. The body of the lock was clean. Whoever had locked this door had used a lock that they had expected to come back for. I lifted the bolt cutters. They were heavier than I had expected, although Caleb had picked out the smaller of the two pairs the store carried. I positioned the jaws around one of the chain links just above the lock. I set my feet. I leaned my weight into the handles. The chain link did not give immediately. I had to shift my grip and try again. On the second attempt, with my full weight on both handles, the link parted with a small sharp sound and a small spark of fresh metal where the cut had gone through. I set down the bolt cutters. I lifted the chain free of the hasp. The padlock came with it. I set both on the floor. I lifted the hasp. I pulled open the inner door. The hinges complained the way hinges complain when they have not been moved in 50 years. The door swung in, not out, into the interior of the inner room. The air that came out was not the cool, damp air of the front section. It was different. It was drier. It had the particular smell of cured wood and machine oil and old leather, the smell of a place that had been kept and then sealed and then left. I shone the flashlight in. The beam moved across the floor first because that is where I had pointed it. The floor was wood, the same raised joist construction as the back section in the front room, but in better condition. The boards were tight and the finish was still visible on them in patches. The beam moved up along the south wall and I saw the bench. It was a workbench. A long, heavy workbench 12 feet long, set against the south wall, with a top of laminated maple and a vise mounted at the near end. Above the bench, mounted on the wall, was a pegboard. Tools hung on the pegboard. The tools were arranged in the way tools are arranged by a person who used them every day, and who put them back in the same place every evening. I moved the beam slowly along the pegboard. Hand planes, 6 of them, ranging from a small block plane to a long jointing plane, hung in order of size. Chisels, a full set, the handles wrapped with leather. A row of saws, 3 of them, the teeth still sharp under the beam. Marking tools. A set of bevel gauges. Wooden mallets in 2 sizes. Hand drills and bit braces. The beam moved past the bench. On the far side of the room, against the north wall, stood pieces of furniture. I have to tell you what I felt when I saw them because the feeling was important. I had walked into rooms full of old things many times in my life. The library of the Northbridge Consolidated School had a back room where we kept the donated books that were too damaged or too obscure to put on the public shelves, and I had spent many afternoons in that room with my hands on books that had been somebody's whole world once and were now waiting to be read again or to be quietly retired. I had walked into estate sales with friends. I had been through Walter's father's barn after his father died, sorting tools and tack and the small collected things of a working man's lifetime. This was not like those. This was a room that had been left, not abandoned. A room that had been closed by a person who had locked the door behind them, and had taken the key and had meant in some way they had still been able to mean it to come back. The pieces of furniture were not stored. They were placed against the wall with care, the way you place things in a room you are leaving for a while and want to come back to. I moved the beam slowly across them. A secretary desk. Tall, narrow, with a slant front lid and a glazed bookcase above. The wood looked like cherry under the dust, with inlay along the edges of the drawers that I could not make out fully in the flashlight beam. The piece stood as straight and square as the day it had been built. Whoever had built it to last several lifetimes. 2 side chairs. A small writing table. A long low chest with brass corner mounts. A standing wardrobe with twin doors. At the far end of the room against the west wall I saw a smaller piece. A cedar chest. Smaller than the others. The size of a large suitcase, set on the floor where the workbench ended. I stood in the doorway with the flashlight beam moving slowly over all of it, and I understood that I had walked into the working life of a man who had been good at his work, and that the work had been waiting for someone to find it for a long time. I stepped into the room. The floor did not creak. The boards were tight. I crossed slowly to the workbench. I set my flashlight down on the bench top and the beam pointed up at the ceiling, lighting the rafters above. The ceiling was finished. The original icehouse roof structure had been lined on the inside with planed pine boards, fitted together with care, to make a finished ceiling for the workshop. The walls behind the furniture were similarly lined. Whoever had built this had not just thrown up a partition. He had built a room. I looked at the tools on the pegboard. They were not the tools of a man who had used a workshop as a hobby. They were the tools of a man who had built furniture for a living. The hand planes were Stanley bedrock planes from the 1930s and 1940s, the good ones, the ones that woodworkers still hunt for at auctions. The chisels were a set of English firmer chisels with the handles wrapped carefully in soft leather. The marking tools were the precise instruments of a man who had been trained in a tradition. The saws were 2 backsaws and a long crosscut, and the teeth on all 3 were as crisp as if they had been sharpened the week before. A man had worked here. A serious man. A man who had cared. I turned to look at the secretary desk. It was, in the daylight that was beginning to come in through the open inner door behind me from the front section, more beautiful than I had been able to see with only the flashlight. The wood was cherry, as I had thought, with bird's-eye maple inlay along the panels of the bookcase doors and the front of the slant lid. The brass hardware was the original brass, fluted pulls on the drawers with small ivory escutcheons around the keyholes. The piece stood about 6 feet tall. It was, I understood, standing in front of it, a masterwork. I opened the lid of the slant top. The interior of the desk was fitted with small drawers and pigeonholes, the way good secretaries were fitted. The little drawers had ivory pulls. The pigeonholes were divided by thin partitions of bird's-eye maple. Everything was empty except for one of the small drawers in the middle, which had something in it. I pulled the drawer out gently. Inside was a small folded paper. I lifted it out. I unfolded it on the slant lid in the light from the doorway. It was a card. A simple business card hand-printed on heavy cream stock. The print was in black ink, in a sober serif typeface in 2 languages. The English read, Otto Stein Fine Cabinetry and Restoration Northbridge, Vermont. Below the English, in slightly smaller print, the same information was given in German. Below the German, in fountain pen ink, handwritten by a careful hand that had developed its careful handwriting on a continent that no longer existed. For Mrs. Hadley, in advance. I held the card in my hand for a long time. It is one thing to be told the name of a man who once lived on a piece of land. It is another thing to find, in the drawer of a piece of furniture he made, a card he had hand-printed with his name on it, addressed to a person he had never met but had somehow imagined would eventually open the drawer. The card could not, in any reasonable sense, have been written to me. Otto Stein had been dead before I had married Walter, before I had moved to Northbridge, before I had been Mrs. Hadley in any way that could have been addressed. The card had not been written to me. The card had been left, generally, in a drawer of a piece of furniture, as the kind of business card that a craftsman leaves in his finished work the way other craftsmen carve their initials on the back of a chair. But the wording was strange. In advance. Not in care of, not for the future owner, not to whom it may concern. In advance. I set the card down on the slant lid. I would come back to it. I turned to the cedar chest. The chest was small, as I had said, the size of a large suitcase. It was made of a wood I did not immediately recognize, with a hinged top and a small brass latch. It was not locked. I crouched down in front of it the way a librarian crouches in front of a low shelf, and I lifted the latch and I raised the lid. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The smell that came out of the chest was the smell of cedar wood and old paper, and a small trace of something else I did not at first recognize and which I would later understand was the smell of a particular kind of leather binding used on European photograph albums in the 1920s and 30s. The chest was full. Not crammed full. Carefully full, the way a chest is full when a person has packed it with intention. On top, folded with care, was a heavy linen tablecloth, embroidered along the edges in white on white with a pattern of small flowers. Beneath the tablecloth, when I lifted it, was a layer of folded clothing. A man's wool waistcoat, dark brown with cloth-covered buttons. 2 folded shirts, white, the cuffs and collars stitched by hand. Beneath the clothing, separated by a sheet of waxed paper, was a small wooden box, the size of a thick book, which I lifted out and set on the floor of the workshop beside me. I opened the box. Inside the box were photographs. I want to tell you about the photographs carefully, because they are the part of the morning that changed everything. There were perhaps 40 of them. They were black and white, the kind of photographs taken between the early 1920s and the late 1930s, on continental European cameras, printed on the small heavy paper of that period. Most of them had been mounted, originally, in an album, but the album had at some point been disassembled and the individual prints had been bundled and tied with a length of thin cotton string. The string was knotted on top, the way a person knots a parcel they want to keep together for a long time. I untied the string. The top photograph showed a young man and a young woman standing in front of a wooden gate, somewhere with cobblestones underfoot and a building with tall narrow windows visible behind them. The young man was perhaps 25 years old. He was thin and dark-haired and was wearing a suit that had been well made but did not fit him perfectly. The young woman was perhaps the same age. She was small. She had dark hair pinned up in the way young women pinned their hair up in 1930, and she was wearing a light-colored dress with a darker collar, and she was looking at the camera with a small careful smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The young man had his hand on her elbow. The hand was steady. The photograph had the small soft focus of a portable camera held by a friend who had been asked to take it. On the back of the photograph in pencil, in a different hand than the one on the business card but a hand from the same period and the same education, was written, Berlin, my 1930. Otto und Esther. I sat down on the wood floor of the workshop, because my legs would not hold me. Esther. I had heard the name once in my childhood from my mother, in a conversation she had been having with my aunt at the kitchen table when she had not known I was within hearing. She had said, Esther was the youngest of us. She did not come. That was all I had heard. My mother had been a child of 2 when her family had emigrated, and her sister Hannah, my grandmother, had been the only one of the older generation who had come with them. The rest had stayed. The rest, I had been told in the careful way these things were told, had not survived. There had been another sister. There had been an Esther. I had heard the name once. I had not heard it again until I had read the letter in my mother's drawer in 1992, the letter from Hannah confirming her arrival in America, in which Esther's name had appeared in a small reference toward the end. The translator at the library had translated the line for me. Tell Esther I am safe. Tell her to come when she can. Esther had not come. I held the photograph in my hand. I turned it over. The pencil writing on the back was clear. Otto und Esther. May 1930. Berlin. I lifted the next photograph from the bundle. It was the young woman alone in a different dress, sitting at a small table by a window, holding a book. The window had a view of rooftops. The book was open on her lap. She was looking at the camera with the same small careful smile. On the back, Esther Tiergartenstrasse 14, Berlin, 1929. I lifted the next. It was a group. 6 people. An older man with a beard, an older woman with her hair in a bun, for younger people, 2 men and 2 women. The young man on the left was the same young man as in the first photograph. The young woman in the center between the older man and woman was Esther. The other young woman on the right was a few years older than Esther, and there was something in the shape of her face that I recognized, although I had to look twice to be sure. It was my grandmother. It was Hannah, perhaps 26 years old, before she had emigrated, before she had married my grandfather, before she had become the Hannah I had known as a child, the small woman in the kitchen on Sundays who made plum cake and who did not like having her picture taken. She was standing next to Esther in front of a brick building, and she was looking at the camera, and she had her arm linked through Esther's arm. On the back in pencil, Die Family Lieberman, Berlin, summer 1928. The Lieberman family. My family. The family I had come from on my mother's side. The family that had not, except for Hannah and her infant daughter and her husband, made it out. I sat on the wood floor of the workshop with the photograph in my hand, and I did not move for a long time. The flashlight on the bench was still pointing up at the ceiling, and the daylight from the inner door behind me was reaching the floor where I sat. The cedar chest stood open. The other photographs were in their bundle. The little wooden box was beside me on the floor. I want to tell you what was happening in my mind in that moment, because it is the only way to explain what I did next. I was thinking about my mother. My mother had been born in 1929. She had been carried out of Germany in 1932 in her sister's arms, as a small child, while her parents and her younger sister and the rest of the family had stayed because they had thought they had time. They had not had time. My mother had grown up in Vermont with her sister Hannah as her mother and her brother-in-law as her father, although she had known the truth of her parentage by the age of 10 and had carried it quietly for the rest of her life. She had become, when she had married my father in 1953, a woman who did not talk about Germany. She had taught me almost nothing. She had given me almost nothing except the lacquer box of photographs that I had found in her dresser after she had died, and which had contained 4 photographs only, one of her parents, one of Hannah as a young bride, one of herself as a baby in Hannah's arms, and one small photograph of 2 young women, no caption, no names, that I had not been able to identify, but which I had kept anyway. I knew, even as I sat in the workshop on the wood floor, what the small unidentified photograph would prove to be when I went home and compared it. It would be Hannah and Esther. The same photograph as one of the photographs in this chest, or one taken on the same afternoon. My mother had carried one copy of that photograph with her for her entire life and had kept it in a lacquer box in her dresser and had not, in all the years I had known her, taken it out and shown it to me. She had not been able to. That was the thing I understood, on the floor of the workshop on Old Mill Road, in the cool dry air of a room that had been sealed for 50 years. My mother had not been able to talk about Esther. Esther had been her older sister, in the original family, before Hannah had become her mother in America. My mother had been 3 years old when the family had separated. She had not remembered Esther in the way an adult remembers a person. She had remembered her in the way a small child remembers, in flashes, in a feeling, in a name that her own older sister mother could not bring herself to say out loud. And so my mother had not said it either. I had been raised by a woman who had been raised by her own grief, and had not been able to put it down. I had thought, for most of my adult life, that the silence I had grown up with had been a German silence, the silence of the country of my mother's birth, the silence imposed by what had happened there. I understood now that it had been a more specific silence. It had been the silence of a particular name. Esther. Otto Stein had known Esther. That was the thing I was holding in my hand, in the photograph from Berlin in May of 1930. Otto und Esther with his hand on her elbow, in front of a wooden gate on a cobblestone street, in a city that was, at that moment in their lives, still a city they could imagine staying in. He had known her. He had loved her possibly, in the way the photograph suggested, with a love that was young and serious and had not yet been tested by anything. He had survived. He had come to America. He had ended up in Vermont on this exact half-acre, in a cottage that no longer stood, beside an ice house he had converted into a workshop. He had built furniture for a living. He had died in 1971. And he had left, locked inside a small room behind a sealed door, a cedar chest full of photographs of the woman he had loved, and her family, and his own family, and a business card that said, in fountain pen ink in his careful handwriting, "For Mrs. Hadley in advance. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to overinterpret a card." The card had not been left for me. Otto Stein could not have known that a woman named June Lieberman, the granddaughter of Esther's older sister Hannah, would one day marry a man named Walter Hadley in a town 20 miles from Brattleboro and would, decades after that, lose her husband and then lose her home and then walk into a tax sale and bid $6 for a half-acre of land on Old Mill Road. He could not have known any of that. The card had been left for whoever would eventually open the door. Mrs. Hadley was a placeholder. Polite formality. But the card had been left. That was the thing I held in my mind, on the floor of the workshop, with the photographs around me and the morning light coming in through the inner door. He had left something. He had thought, in some part of himself, that the right person would come. I tied the string around the photographs again. I put the bundle back in the small wooden box. I put the wooden box back in the cedar chest, on top of the folded waistcoat. I closed the lid of the chest. I did not close the latch. The chest had been holding its contents alone for 50 years. It could hold them another afternoon while I sat with what I had found. I stood up slowly. My knees were stiff. I had been on the floor for an hour, although it had felt like 10 minutes. I walked once around the workshop. The full inventory of what was in the room I would not understand for another week. There was more in the deep drawers under the workbench. There was a second small chest behind the wardrobe, which I would not open until the following Tuesday. There was, in the lower compartment of the secretary desk, the leather-bound journal that would eventually tell me the rest of Otto Stein's story. There was, in a flat envelope tucked into the back of one of the small drawers of the secretary, a single document I would come to think of as the most important piece of paper in the room, and which I had not yet found. I did not understand any of that yet. I understood only that I had walked into a room that had been waiting for someone who could read it, and that I, in the small particular accident of being Hannah Lieberman's granddaughter and June Hadley's wife and a woman who had been pushed out of one life into another, was the someone the room had been waiting for. Not because I had been chosen, because I had been the one who had come. I locked the inner door, although I no longer had a padlock for it. I pulled it closed and the latch caught, and I leaned a piece of 2x4 I had found in the front section against the bottom of it, the way a person braces a door they do not want to swing open in their absence. I locked the outer padlock with the key. I walked back to the car. I drove home. I went into the kitchen on Ashfield Road. I took down my mother's lacquer box from the shelf above the refrigerator, where I had kept it since 1992. I opened the box. I took out the small unidentified photograph of the two young women. I held it up next to one of the photographs from the workshop, which I had carried home in my coat pocket, although I had not made a conscious decision to do so. It was the same photograph. The same afternoon. The same gate. The same two young women, my grandmother Hannah and her sister Esther, standing arm in Berlin in 1928 or 1929, looking at a camera held by a friend, neither of them yet knowing what the next 20 years would bring. My mother had kept her copy in a lacquer box for 60 years, and had not been able to tell me what it was. Otto Stein had kept his copy in a cedar chest in a sealed room for 50 years and had not, while he was alive, been able to find anyone to give it to. The two copies had finally come together in my kitchen on a Saturday afternoon in late September, on a piece of pine table that had been Walter's grandfather's, in a house I had 4 weeks left to live in. I sat down at the table. I did not cry. I had used up my crying earlier in the week, on the morning Garrett had stood in the kitchen with the manila envelope, and I did not have any left for the photograph. What I felt was something quieter and less expected. I felt held. I felt held by a man I had never met, who had loved a woman who had been my great-aunt, and who had kept her memory in a cedar chest in a stone building for 50 years, and who had left, in the drawer of a piece of furniture he had made with his hands, a small business card that said in advance. I called Marjorie that evening. I did not tell her on the phone what I had found. I had not yet found the words for it, and I wanted to find them in front of her face, not on a telephone line. I told her instead that I had opened the inner door, and that there had been a workshop, and that I would need her help in the weeks ahead. I asked her if she would be free on Tuesday afternoon to come out to the property with me, because I wanted a second pair of eyes and a second mind on what I had found, and Marjorie was the second mind I trusted most in Northbridge. She said she would come. I went back to the property by myself on Sunday morning, the day after I had opened the inner door. I had not planned to. I had planned on Saturday night to spend Sunday packing. But I had woken at 6 and had not been able to put my mind on the kitchen, and at 7 I had been in the car, and at 7:30 I had been unlocking the outer padlock for the second time in 2 days. The workshop felt different in the morning light. Saturday had been an afternoon discovery, with the slant of late September sun coming in from one side. Sunday was an even gray light, the diffuse light of a clouded morning, and it lit the room more evenly. The room looked in that light smaller than it had felt the day before. It was 12 by 20 by my pacing, a space the size of a generous bedroom, a man's working room. I sat down on the floor in front of the workbench, on a folded canvas drop cloth I had brought with me. I drank coffee from a thermos. I did not, at first, open anything. I wanted to sit in the room and feel the shape of it. A workshop tells you about its maker. The pegboard told me Otto Stein had been a man of order. The wear pattern on the floor in front of the bench, faint but visible if you knew to look for it, told me he had stood there for thousands of hours over 30 years. The small jar of mineral oil on a shelf near the vise, still half full, told me he had cared for his tools daily. The piece of soft cloth folded next to the jar told me he had wiped them after every use. A workshop also tells you about its silences. There was no chair at the workbench. Otto had worked standing. There was no photograph pinned to the wall. He had not, even here, wanted Esther's face where his eye would fall on it while he worked. There was no radio. He had wanted in this room only the sound of his own tools. I opened the long low chest with the brass corner mounts. Inside, neatly stacked, were several finished pieces of small work. A breadboard with handles cut in the shape of leaves. 3 jewelry boxes of different sizes, the joinery dovetailed by hand. A pair of carved wooden bookends in the shape of open books. A small writing slope, no larger than a folded newspaper, with a hinged lid and a fitted compartment for ink and pens. None of the pieces had any particular signature on them. None of them had been left there because they had failed. They had been left there because the man who had made them had not, when he had set them in the chest, known where else to put them, or had not had any orders to fill, or had simply made them because he had wanted to. I sat with the writing slope on my lap for a long time. It was beautiful. It was the work of a man who had been trained somewhere in Europe before the war, and had carried his training with him across an ocean, and had not stopped doing the work even when there had stopped being a market for what he made. It was the work of a man who had needed, more than he had needed money, to keep his hands moving. I put the writing slope back in the chest. I closed the lid. I locked the inner door behind me with the new padlock I had brought. I drove home. The next 2 weeks were the weeks of moving. I will not describe them in detail, because the detail of packing a house you did not own and were not entitled to keep is the kind of detail that a reader does not need to live through with the writer. I will say that I sorted through 27 years of married life and tried to determine what was mine, and that the determination was harder than I had expected, because Walter and I had merged our possessions the way couples do, and the line between his and mine had grown indistinct over time. I will say that I took my books. I will say that I took my mother's lacquer box and the small sewing chest that had been my grandmother Hannah's. I will say that I took the kitchen things I had brought with me when I had married Walter, and a small set of dishes that we had bought together in 1998 that I knew Garrett would not want. I will say that I left the photographs of Walter that were in the house, except for one, which I took because I could not bear to leave it, and which I packed carefully in a box that I sealed with tape and did not label. I rented a small storage unit in town for the things I could not yet fit in the ice house. I called a man named Russell Hatch who owned a flatbed and a small box truck and who agreed to move me on the second Saturday in October, for $300, which was a fair price and which I paid in advance because Russell preferred to be paid in advance. Garrett called twice during those 2 weeks. The first call was brief and polite. He wanted to confirm the timing. He wanted to know if I needed help with the movers. He wanted to know what I was planning to take and what I was planning to leave. I told him, in the small short way of a woman who had stopped trying to make Garrett comfortable, that I would take what was mine and leave the rest, and that the determination of what was mine was a determination I would make without his help. He said in his polite voice that he was sure I would be reasonable about it. The second call was sharper. He had heard, he said, from someone in town, that I had bought a piece of property at the tax sale. He wanted to know what I had bought. He wanted to know what it had cost. He wanted to know whether I had used any of the money from his father's estate to buy it. I told him I had used $6 from my own savings, which was true, and that the property had no relevance to him, which was also true. He said, in the careful way of a man laying down a marker, that he was glad I was landing on my feet, and that he hoped I would let him know if anything came up that he should be aware of. I told him I would not. I hung up the phone. I stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at it. I understood that Garrett's interest in the property was not over. I understood that whatever I had found in the ice house, if it was anything of value, would eventually become information he would try to make his. I would have to be careful. I drove Marjorie out to the property on the Tuesday afternoon I had asked her about. I showed her the inner room. I showed her the workbench and the tools and the furniture. I showed her the cedar chest. I did not, that afternoon, show her the photographs. I wanted Marjorie's professional eyes on the property and the contents before I gave her the family piece of it, because Marjorie was a careful person and would think more clearly if I did not give her the emotional information first. Marjorie walked through the workshop slowly. She did not touch anything for the first 5 minutes. She walked the perimeter of the room with her hands clasped behind her back, the way she had used to walk the stacks at the library when she was helping me decide which donated books to keep. She crouched in front of the secretary desk. She ran her hand along the inlay. She stood up. She looked at me. "June," she said. "I know. You have something here. I know. This is not what I thought it was when I told you about the parcel. I want to say that. I want to say it now, clearly, in case there is ever a question. When I told you about this property, I thought you would find a stone shell with a leaky roof. I did not know about any of this. I know that, Marjorie. She nodded. She was clearing herself the way a careful person clears themselves at the beginning of something that may matter later. I understood. I appreciated it. She walked back to the workbench. She looked at the tools. These planes, she said. Stanley bedrocks. From the 30s and 40s. I am not a woodworker, but I know what those go for at auction. The big ones can be $1,000 a piece. The set together would be more than the sum of the pieces. Yes. She turned to look at the secretary desk again. That piece, she said slowly. I do not even know who I am looking at. I know what the joinery looks like. I do not know who would pay for it. You need an appraiser. A serious one. Not the man in Burlington. Someone who works with collectors. I will make a call. She did. The call she made was to a man named Doug Verrill, who had been in her son's class in high school in the late 70s and who had gone on to become, over 30 years, one of the better-known furniture appraisers in northern New England, with a practice that worked with auction houses in Boston and New York. Doug agreed to come out to Northbridge the following week. In the meantime, I moved. The final morning at the house on Ashfield Road was a Friday. Russell would come on Saturday. Friday was the day for the last things, the small things that had been left for the end because I had not been able to face them earlier in the week. I walked through the house one room at a time. I started in the parlor and I worked toward the kitchen, in the same order I would have walked through it on any morning of the past 27 years. The parlor was already mostly cleared. The few things I had been keeping had been packed 2 days before. What was left was furniture that had been Walter's parents' furniture, and the rug we had bought together in 2007, and the photographs on the mantel that I was leaving for Garrett because they were photographs of his father and his grandparents and were not mine to take. In the front hall I stood for a moment by the coat closet. Walter's coats were still in it. I had not been able in 3 years to give them away. I had told myself on many mornings that I would do it the following week. I had not done it. I left the coats in the closet. Garrett could decide. In the kitchen I made a final pot of tea. I drank a cup at the long pine table for the last time. I rinsed the cup. I dried it. I packed it in the last of the boxes. I went into Walter's study, which I had used very little after he died because I had not been able to sit in his chair. I had cleared the desk earlier in the week. What was left was the bookshelves which I was leaving and the chair which I was leaving, and the framed photograph on the wall of Walter and his father standing in front of the house in 1971, which I was also leaving because the photograph was Garrett's by any reading. I stood in the doorway. I did not go in. In the bedroom I made the bed for the last time with the sheets I would not be taking, because Garrett was the kind of man who would notice an unmade bed and would file it as evidence of something. I straightened the quilt. I closed the closet doors. I walked back to the kitchen. I set my house keys on the long pine table. Picked up my purse. I walked to the front door. I turned around once in the doorway and I looked at the house from the inside for the last time. It was a good house. It had been a good house. The light through the front hall window was the same gentle morning light it had always been. The faint smell of the kitchen, lemon polish and tea, and the small ghost of cinnamon from a cake I had baked the week before, was the smell of a home. I had been a good wife in this house. I had loved a good man here. Whatever had been wrong in the papers had not, in any way I could feel standing in the doorway, been wrong in the days. I closed the door. I locked it. I put the keys through the mail slot because Garrett had told me in his polite second phone call that he wanted the keys returned that way. I heard them hit the floor of the front hall on the inside. I walked to my car. I did not look back. I will tell you only the smallest version of the moving day, because I do not want to give it more weight than it deserves. Russell Hatch came at 7 on the second Saturday in October with his truck. He and his son Bryce loaded the things I had separated, the books and the furniture I had brought with me into the marriage and the kitchen things and the small box of Walter's photograph that I had not labeled, and we drove them out to Old Mill Road. We unloaded them into the front section of the ice house, which I had cleaned out and swept and which I had covered with a tarp on the floor to keep things off the packed earth. I had ordered a small generator and a propane heater from a hardware supply in Brattleboro, and they were waiting on the parcel when we arrived. Russell helped me set them up. He did not ask many questions about what I was doing or why I was moving into an ice house. He took the $300 in cash, said good luck, and drove away. I stood in the front section of the ice house in the early afternoon October light with my things around me in boxes and the generator running quietly outside and the propane heater warming the air slowly toward something livable, and I locked the inner door of the workshop with a new padlock I had bought at Caleb's Hardware, and I sat down on a folding camp chair I had brought with me, and I drank a cup of tea from a thermos, and I understood that I had moved. That night, I slept on a camp cot in the front section, with the propane heater on a low setting and the generator running just long enough to charge the small battery that ran my reading lamp. The stone walls held the heat better than I had expected. The cot was not comfortable, but I had slept on worse. The smell of the building was the smell I was beginning to think of as the smell of my own house. Wood and stone and the small dry trace of the workshop air that came under the inner door at the back. In the morning I would meet Doug Verrill for the first time, and he would walk through the inner room with the careful attention of a man who had spent 30 years looking at furniture, and he would tell me in language I would have to ask him to slow down and repeat what was in my workshop. In the afternoon I would open the lower compartment of the secretary desk and I would find the leather-bound journal in which Otto Stein had written, in English and German over the course of 20 years, the story I had been waiting to hear without knowing I had been waiting for it. I did not know any of that yet. On the cot in the front section in the October dark, I knew only that I had moved. I knew only that the deed had my name on it. I knew only that the photograph of two young women in Berlin in 1928 was on the small folding table beside the cot, in a frame I had brought from the house on Ashfield Road, and that the lamp was lit, and that the face of my grandmother Hannah, before she had been my grandmother, was looking out at me with the small careful smile of a young woman who could not yet know that her younger sister Esther would not come. I turned off the lamp. I lay in the dark. The stone walls of the ice house held the small sounds of the night outside. The small October sounds of leaves moving and an owl calling once at a distance and the small click of the propane heater cycling on and off, and I closed my eyes and I slept. Doug Verrill arrived at the property at 9 on Sunday morning. He drove a white pickup with a small enclosed trailer hitched behind it, the kind of trailer a man brings when he expects he may need to take something out with him at the end of the visit. He parked at the entrance to the dirt track. He walked the 50 yards on foot, and he carried a leather case and a small folding stool, and he was a man of about my own age, with white hair and a salt and pepper beard and the kind of careful watching eyes I had learned to associate with the few people who really knew their work. He introduced himself on the dirt path outside the ice house. He shook my hand once firmly and said he was sorry he had not come up sooner, but the drive from Burlington was an hour and a half and he had needed to clear his Sunday. "Marjorie said you have a workshop," he said. She did not say what kind. I did not know what kind to tell her. I said, "That is fair." I unlocked the outer door. I let him in through the front section, which I had cleared the previous week and which now held my camp cot and my folding chair and my few boxes, all of which Doug glanced over with the small uninterested attention of a man who was not there for what was on top. I unlocked the new padlock on the inner door. I pulled the door open and I stepped aside. Doug walked into the workshop. He did not say anything for the first 3 minutes. He set his leather case down on the floor near the inner door. He set the folding stool down beside it. Then he walked the perimeter of the room slowly, the way Marjorie had walked it on the Tuesday, but with the difference of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. He looked at the tools on the pegboard. He looked at the workbench and ran one finger along the edge of the maple top. He crouched in front of the secretary desk. He stood up. He looked at the side chairs. He looked at the long low chest. He looked at the wardrobe. He looked at the cedar chest at the far end. He came back to the secretary desk. He took out a pair of reading glasses and put them on. He bent down and put his face close to the inlay. He moved along the front of the piece with his face 2 inches from the wood. He stood up. "June," he said, "I want to be careful about what I am about to tell you, because I do not want you to make any decisions on the basis of a first walkthrough. I am going to need a full afternoon in this room, and I am going to need to take photographs, and I am probably going to want to bring my partner up next week for a second opinion on the secretary. But I will tell you what I am looking at. Please." He gestured at the secretary desk. "This piece," he said, "is the work of a master cabinet maker who trained in the Berlin School in the 1920s. I can see it in the construction. The dovetailing of the drawer fronts. The way the inlay is laid into the field instead of veneered over it. The proportions of the bookcase top to the slant front. I cannot tell you who made it without more research, but the man who made this piece was trained by someone who knew what he was doing, and he absorbed everything his teacher knew, and he then spent the next 40 years getting better at it. He paused. You said the man's name was Otto Stein, he said. That is the name on a card I found in one of the drawers. I do not recognize the name, but that does not mean anything. There were many fine cabinet makers in pre-war Berlin who never made it into the books because they did not have the chance to make a reputation in the way the lucky ones did. If your Otto Stein got out in 1938, as you say, he was 25 or 30 years old and he had not yet had time to be famous. He came to America and he kept working. He made these pieces. He died. The pieces stayed in this room. That is how a body of work goes unrecorded. It is not unusual. It is in some ways the rule. I sat down on the camp chair I had brought in from the front section. What is the piece worth? I said. Doug looked at me over the top of his glasses. June, he said. I do not give numbers on a first walkthrough. I am going to write you a proper report. But I will tell you what I am thinking because I think you should have it in your head. The secretary, properly authenticated, properly cleaned, and presented to the right buyer, would sell at auction in Boston or New York for somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000. I am being conservative. The side chairs are a matched pair. The long chest is unusual and would interest a particular kind of collector. The wardrobe is the least valuable piece in the room because the market for armoires is soft, but it is still well made. The writing slope in the long chest, if you take care of it, would sell for $2,000 to $4,000 to the right buyer. He stopped. He looked at me. The tools, he said, are a separate matter. The Stanley Bedrock planes are collector items. The full set, complete, would sell to a tool collector for $15,000 to $20,000. The chisels and saws together would add another 5 or 6. The small hand tools are quality pieces individually, but their value is mostly in being part of an intact shop. He paused again. The total estimate for this room, conservative, is somewhere between $90,000 and $130,000. If the secretary turns out to be by a known maker, which is possible, the number could go higher. I would not want to commit to a higher number until I know more. But I want you to be working with the right range in your mind. I did not say anything for a moment. Doug waited. The cedar chest at the back, I said. I have not had it appraised yet. What is in it? Photographs. Family photographs. Personal things. A small writing slope, I think, although it may be a music box, I have not opened it. Some embroidered linen. A man's clothing. Things of that nature. Doug nodded slowly. The chest itself is a smaller piece, he said. It might be $3,000 or $4,000 if it is what I think it is. The contents are a different question. Family photographs from pre-war Berlin have, in some cases, archival value to the historical institutions. The Holocaust Museum buys them. The Leo Beck Institute in New York buys them. They pay reasonably, but more importantly, they care for the photographs in a way that no private collector will. That is something for you to think about separately from the market value of the cabinetry. Yes. There may also be things in the chest that are not for sale at all, he said. I am only telling you what I would consider, not what you should do. Yes. He gathered up his leather case and his folding stool. He took out a small notebook and wrote down a list of the things he wanted to come back for, and the photographs he wanted to take and the questions he wanted to research. He told me he would be back the following Thursday with his partner. He told me he would have a written report by the end of the month. He did not, on the way out, ask me how I had come to be in possession of the property. He had the small good manner of a man who understood that the story behind a find was not, professionally, his business. I walked him to the truck. One more thing, June, he said, with the door of the truck open. Yes. If anyone else comes around asking about what is in the building, you do not have to tell them anything. The property is yours. The contents are yours. The deed is recorded. If somebody starts pressing you about it, send them to me. I have dealt with that kind of pressure before. He had read me, on the dirt path outside the workshop, more clearly than I had given him credit for. I had not mentioned Garrett. He had inferred Garrett from the small careful way I had asked about value. Thank you, Doug. It is what I am for. He got in his truck. He drove back to Burlington. I locked the outer padlock and I went back inside to my camp cot and my folding chair and my few boxes, and I sat down and I put my hands on my knees and I tried to think about what he had told me. $90,000 to $130,000. I had bid $6 at a tax sale because I had been desperate and a kind friend had thought I should have a roof and a piece of land of my own. I had walked, by what could not be called planning and could not quite be called accident, into a room that was worth more than the $18,000 I had thought was my entire material wealth. It was not a fortune. I want to be careful about that, in the way I had been careful about my father's number on the appraisal page, except that this was different because I had no father here, and the appraisal page was being held by a stranger with a leather case who would drive back to Burlington and write his report alone. It was not a fortune. It was, again, the kind of number that meant the next part of my life would be made from stability instead of desperation. Roof. Well. Septic. Insulation. A small drilled foundation footing for an addition that would extend the front of the ice house out into the parcel and make it a livable year-round dwelling. A modest sum left for an investment or a foundation or something else I had not yet decided. I made a cup of tea on the propane camp stove. I sat with it on the camp chair for a long time. I did not, that Sunday afternoon, go back into the workshop. I had been told what was in it. I needed a day to sit with what I had been told. In the evening, I called Carol Brennan at home, even though it was a Sunday and even though Carol did not usually take calls at home, because Carol had been the lawyer who had told me, on the day after Garrett had stood in my kitchen, that the document was what Garrett had said it was. I wanted Carol to be my lawyer for what was coming too. I wanted her to know what we were looking at before Garrett did. Carol picked up on the third ring. I told her what Doug had told me. I told her about the inner room and the contents in the appraisal range. I told her, in a few sentences, about the photographs and what I had begun to understand about who Otto Stein had been. There was a silence on the line. "June," Carol said, "I want you to come into the office tomorrow morning. Bring the deed. Bring the tax sale paperwork. Bring a copy of Doug's notes if you can. I want to put a few things on the record before any of this becomes a question." "Garrett does not know yet," I said. "Garrett will know within a week," Carol said. "Northbridge is not a town where a man like Doug Verrill drives an enclosed trailer to a property on Old Mill Road without somebody noticing. We will be ahead of that conversation if you come in tomorrow." "All right." "And June." "Yes. What you have found is not what Garrett thinks it is going to be. He is going to assume when he hears that this is a salvage operation. He is going to assume you have found a few old tools that might be worth something. He is going to come in light. We will let him come in light. We will let him show his hand. Then we will respond." I went into the office on Monday morning. Carol drew up 2 documents that afternoon. The first was a formal recording of the chain of title of the parcel and a notice of completed transfer, filed at the county clerk's office, establishing that the property and all contents thereof had been transferred to me by the tax sale of the 18th of September, and that no claims of any kind on the parcel had been outstanding at the time of transfer. This was a routine filing. It was the kind of filing that mattered only later, when somebody tried to argue that some prior interest in the property had not been extinguished. The second document was a letter of representation, on Crane and Whitfield letterhead, which Carol had drafted in the careful flat language of country attorneys, stating that any inquiries about the Old Mill Road parcel or its contents should be directed to her office. She filed the first. She held the second. "We will send this only if we need to," she said. "I do not want to put Garrett on notice before he gives us a reason. Sometimes a man like Garrett, given enough time and silence, makes a worse move than he would have made if you had warned him." "All right." On Monday afternoon I went back to the ice house. I unlocked the inner door. I went to the secretary desk. I had not, on Saturday, looked into the lower compartment of the desk. The slant lid had given me the small drawer with the business card. The drawers and pigeonholes inside the slant section had been empty except for that drawer. But the secretary had a lower section as well. 2 long drawers in the base below the slant front, with the brass fluted pulls and the ivory escutcheons. I opened the top drawer of the lower section. Inside, on a folded sheet of soft cloth, lay a book. It was bound in dark brown leather, the size of a thick novel, with no title on the spine and no marking on the cover except a small embossed pattern at the corners. The leather had aged to a deep saddle color. The binding was tight. The book had been kept in a dry, dark place for a long time and had been protected. I lifted it out gently. I sat on the floor of the workshop, in the same place I had sat on Saturday morning when I had opened the cedar chest. I opened the book. The pages were lined writing paper, sewn into the binding by hand. The writing on the first page was in fountain pen ink, in the same careful hand as the business card. The first entry was dated in the upper right corner, in pencil. 1 My 1951. The first paragraph was in German. I could not read it. I had taken French in high school. My mother had spoken English to me from the day I was born and had not, except for occasional small phrases I had not understood, used any of her own language in my hearing. I had grown up unable to read what my own grandmother had written in her letters. I turned the page. The second entry, also dated 1951, was also in German. The third was in English. The third entry began, I am writing this in English now because I have been here for 13 years and I do not want to forget how to write in English the way I have begun to forget how to write in German. I am writing in this book what I will not say out loud. There is no one I can say it out loud to. There may be no one I will ever be able to say it out loud to. So I will write it. I read that paragraph twice. Then I went back to the beginning of the book, and I began, with the help of the small German-English dictionary I had bought at Caleb's Hardware on the way out of town earlier in the morning, to work my way through Otto Stein's life. I will not give you all of it. I will give you the part that matters. He had been born in Berlin in 1909. His father had been a cabinet maker, and his father's father before him. He had been apprenticed in his father's shop at 14. He had completed his journeyman's papers in 1928. He had set up, in 1929, a small workshop of his own in the courtyard of a building on Lindenstrasse. Esther Lieberman had been a customer's daughter. Her father had commissioned a desk for his eldest daughter Hannah's wedding in the spring of 1929, and Esther, who was 18, had come to the workshop with her father to discuss the design. Otto had been 20. He had drawn the desk. He had built it. He had delivered it to the Lieberman household at Tiergartenstrasse 14 in October of 1929, and had been invited in to drink coffee with the family. Esther had been at the table. They had courted, in the careful way of young people of their generation and station, for the next 3 years. They had not been engaged formally, because Esther was the youngest and her parents had wanted to see Hannah's marriage settled first. But they had been understood. There were entries describing walks in the Tiergarten, an afternoon at a café in the Mitte, a winter evening at the opera when Otto had borrowed a suit from his older brother because he had not owned one good enough. Hannah had emigrated to America with her husband and her infant daughter in October of 1932. The journal noted this with the small careful sadness of a man recording the departure of a member of a circle he had come to consider his own. Esther had written to Hannah faithfully through the early 30s. Otto had read some of the replies, because Esther had shared them with him. In 1935 the journal began to change. Otto wrote, in an entry dated November of that year, that he had begun to understand what was coming and that Esther's family had not yet understood it. He had asked Esther to marry him and to leave with him. Esther had said yes. Her parents had said no, that they would not be separated, that things would settle. He wrote that he had argued with Mr. Lieberman across the dinner table at Tiergartenstrasse 14 for the only time in his life. Mr. Lieberman had told him, with the dignity of a man who would not be moved, that the Lieberman family did not run. The next entries were sparse. In 1937 Otto wrote that his own father had died and his workshop had been taken from him by an Aryanization order. Esther was working as a teacher in a small school that was being allowed for the moment to continue. He had begged her again to leave with him. She had said she could not leave her parents and her younger brother and had asked him to go without her, and to wait for her, and to send for her when he was settled. He had gone in February of 1938, with the help of a cousin who had emigrated to America in 1934, and who had sponsored his entry. He had taken with him his journeyman's tool roll, and a small case of family things and the photographs Esther had given him to keep safe. He had not gotten her out. He had written to her every week of 1938 and 1939. He had received 4 letters in return, the last of them in August of 1939. After September of 1939, the letters had stopped. He had received, in 1942, a single reply through a cousin in Zurich, which had said only that the family had been taken east. He had not received anything after that. He had survived the war in Brooklyn, where his American cousin had taken him in. He had worked at first in a furniture factory and then, beginning in 1947, in his own small shop. He had not married. He had not, the journal said in an entry dated 1953, been able to imagine being married to anyone who was not Esther. He had moved to Vermont in 1957 because his American cousin had died and Brooklyn had become a place he could no longer bear to live in. He had bought, with what he had been able to save, the cottage on Old Mill Road and the half-acre that had come with it, from an estate sale through a Burlington broker. The cottage had been in poor condition. The ice house had been on the parcel, abandoned by the Goss family who had originally built it. He had not at first thought about the ice house. He had restored the cottage. He had built a workshop in the back room of the cottage and had done his cabinetry there. He had sold pieces at the craft fair in Burlington and through a furniture dealer in Boston. He had lived quietly. In 1962, after a hard winter that had cracked the floor of the cottage workshop and had ruined a piece he had been working on, he had decided to move the workshop into the ice house. The thick stone walls would hold a more steady temperature. The room could be sealed against humidity. He had spent the summer of 1962 building the interior wall and finishing the inside of the back section. He had moved his bench and his tools into the new workshop in October of that year. He had also moved into the new workshop the cedar chest. The cedar chest had been in the cottage since he had carried it out of Brooklyn. It contained, by 1962, everything that was left of his life in Berlin. The photographs Esther had given him. The clothing he had brought with him in 1938 and had kept folded for 24 years because the things had been his father's and he could not bring himself to wear them out. The embroidered linen tablecloth that had been a gift from Esther's mother in 1936. A small silver kiddish cup that had belonged to his grandfather. The few letters he had received from Esther in 1938 and 1939, tied with a length of cotton string. He had decided in 1962 that he wanted to keep these things in a place that was separate from the cottage. The cottage was where he lived. The workshop was where he worked. The cedar chest with the things in it would live in the workshop in a quiet corner against the west wall, and he would know it was there and he would not have to look at it every day. In 1965 he had begun, the journal said, to think about what he would do with the things after he was gone. He had no children. He had no surviving family in America except a cousin's daughter who lived in California, and whom he had met twice and who would not understand what the things were. He had thought then about Esther's older sister Hannah, who had emigrated to America in 1932, and whose last known address had been somewhere in northern Vermont. He had not had a current address. He had begun in 1965, in the careful, patient way of a man for whom patience was the only thing he had left, to try to find her. The journal entries from 1965 to 1968 traced this search in small, careful steps. He had written to the Vermont State Archives. He had written to the Burlington Jewish Federation. He had written to a rabbi in St. Johnsbury. He had hired, briefly, a researcher in Boston, who had found a marriage record for Hannah Lieberman in 1933 in Brattleboro. The researcher had found a son and a daughter. The researcher had then, in 1968, found a death notice for Hannah Lieberman Friedman, dated 1965, 3 years before, in a small town outside Brattleboro. She had died in the year Otto had begun to look for her. He had stopped looking then for a while. The journal entries thinned through the early 70s. He had been ill, off and on, with a heart condition that had begun to slow him down. He had continued to make pieces in the workshop, but more slowly. He had continued to attend the craft fair in Burlington once a year. The last entry in the journal was dated August of 1971. He had written in that entry that he had made a decision. He had written that he had no way to find Esther's family directly, because Hannah was dead and Hannah's children would not know who he was and would not, he believed, want to be approached by a strange old man with a chest full of photographs of a sister and an aunt they had never known. He had written that he was going to leave the workshop and the cottage and the contents as he had arranged them. He had written that he was going to seal the inner room of the workshop. He had written that the things in the cedar chest would stay where they were. He had written that whoever eventually came into possession of the property, by inheritance or by purchase or by tax sale or by any of the small accidents of the way property changes hands in a country town, would find what he had left. He had written in the last paragraph, "I do not know who will open this door. I would like to think it will be someone who knows what is in the cedar chest. I do not believe this. I believe the door will be opened by a stranger who will not know. I am writing this journal because I want the stranger, when they come, to know. I want them to know that the things in the chest belong to a young woman named Esther Lieberman, who was born in Berlin in 1911, and who was the brightest person I have known, and who could not be saved. I want them to know that her older sister was Hannah Lieberman, who emigrated to America in 1932 and who lived in Vermont and who had children. I want them to know that I tried to find Hannah while she was alive and did not find her in time, and that I tried after she was gone to find her children, and that I decided in the end that I could not impose myself on people who did not know me, and that I have left it for them or for whoever stands in their place to find me." The journal ended there. There were, in the back of the book, several blank pages. Tucked between the last entry and the first blank page was an envelope. It was sealed with a small wax seal in red. The envelope was addressed, in the careful handwriting of the journal, "To whoever opens this door." I lifted the envelope out. I held it on my lap for a moment. Then I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed on a typewriter, dated August 1971, signed in fountain pen by Otto Stein and witnessed by two names I did not recognize, with a small notarial stamp in the lower corner from a notary in Burlington. The paper was a declaration of intent. It stated that Otto Stein of Old Mill Road in the town of Northbridge in the county of Caledonia in the state of Vermont, hereby declared his intent that all property contained within the inner room of the structure commonly known as the Goss Ice House, including but not limited to all furniture, tools, photographs, documents, personal effects, and any other items therein, were to be considered the property of the descendants of Hannah Lieberman Friedman, formerly of Brattleboro, Vermont, if any such descendants should ever come to possess the parcel or to claim the contents through any legal means, including but not limited to inheritance, purchase, tax sale, or recovery of unclaimed property. He had filed this declaration, the document said, with the county clerk's office of Caledonia County on the 23rd of August 1971. He had wanted, all those years ago, to make sure that if anyone of Hannah's blood ever came into the room, there would be a piece of paper that said the contents had been theirs all along. I sat with the document on my lap on the wood floor of the workshop, and I did not move for a very long time. The afternoon light through the open inner door grew long and gold. The temperature in the workshop did not change, because the stone walls did not let the light into the temperature in the way it changed in other rooms. The air stayed cool and dry. The cedar chest stood against the west wall, where Otto had placed it in 1962. The secretary desk stood against the north wall, where he had placed it when he had finished it, sometime in the late 1960s, with the slant lid that contained the small drawer with the business card and the lower compartment that had held the journal and the envelope. He had built the secretary, I understood, for me. Not for me by name. For whoever I would turn out to be. He had built a piece of furniture, in the last years of his working life, in which to keep his own testament. He had built it slowly, with the inlay and the dovetails and the small ivory escutcheons, because he had needed something to do, and because he had wanted whoever opened the door to find a piece of furniture good enough to make them stop and look at it before they reached for the journal. He had built me a vessel. I had walked into the room and I had opened the lid and I had found, eventually, the journal inside it, and I had read what he had wanted to say, and the saying had reached me 53 years after he had set it down, across the small unbridgeable distance of the two lives that had not quite touched. I drove into town that evening. I went to Carol Brennan's house, not her office, because it was after 6 and because I could not, after the day I had had, wait for Monday morning to do what I needed to do. Carol came to the door in a sweater. She let me in. I sat in her kitchen. I gave her the declaration of intent and the journal and a stack of the photographs from the cedar chest. I told her in a few short sentences what I had read. Carol read the declaration first. She read it twice. She set it down on her kitchen table. June, she said. This is filed. Yes. This is on record at the county clerk's office in Caledonia County, since 1971. Yes. This means that anyone who claims the contents of that workshop, whether through tax sale or any other means, takes them subject to this declaration. The declaration does not pass ownership directly to Hannah's descendants, because Otto Stein no longer owned the parcel when he died. But it establishes intent. It establishes that the contents of that room were never intended to pass to a stranger. It establishes that you, as Hannah's granddaughter, are the person Otto Stein wanted to receive them. And the tax sale. The tax sale gave you the parcel and the structure and, by ordinary operation of law, the contents. The declaration confirms it. You bought the building for $6. You bought the contents along with it free and clear. There is no plaintiff in the world who could come at you on this, June. There is no claim available. She paused. The declaration was filed with the county clerk. That means the existence of the declaration is itself a matter of public record. If Garrett ever does decide to make a play for the contents of the workshop, this document ends the conversation in one motion. We sat in the kitchen for a while. Carol made tea. We did not talk much. We were both sitting with what the declaration meant. It meant Otto had not, even at the end, been alone. It meant that he had imagined someone. He had not known her name. He had not known that her name would be June. He had imagined her anyway, in the form of a granddaughter of Hannah's, and he had filed a piece of paper with a notary in Burlington that said, "She belongs to me, and I belong to her," in the small particular way that a man with no living family belongs to the imagined family of the woman he loved. I went home to the ice house that night and I slept again on the camp cot in the front section, and I dreamed, for the first time in a long time, the dream I had not had since my mother had died. The dream of standing in my mother's kitchen as a child and waiting for her to turn around from the stove and tell me something I had been waiting to hear. Garrett came back to Vermont on the second weekend of November. I had been expecting him in some form. Doug and his partner had finished their work in late October. Doug had filed his appraisal report in early November. The number had come in at the upper end of his initial range, at $138,000 for the cabinetry and tools, with the photographs and personal effects valued separately as having significant archival value to historical institutions but no defined market price. The Boston auction house that Doug worked with had begun, on the basis of his report, to make inquiries on my behalf. A buyer for the secretary desk had been identified within 10 days. A private collector in Connecticut who was prepared to pay $45,000 sight unseen on Doug's authentication. A separate buyer for the Stanley Bedrock plane set had offered $17,000. The pieces were beginning to move. In a small town, none of this stayed quiet. Russell Hatch had told his brother about the moving day. His brother had told a man at the diner. The man at the diner had told another man. Doug Verrill had not told anyone, but the white pickup in the enclosed trailer had been seen at the property on 3 separate visits in October, and people had begun to wonder. Marjorie kept her own counsel, but Marjorie was not the only person in Northbridge who knew anything. Garrett heard, by the small natural channels of country towns, that the woman his father had married, the one he had moved out of his father's house at the end of the 3-year clause, had bought a piece of property at the tax sale that was turning out to contain something he had not anticipated. He drove up on a Saturday morning. He had not called ahead. He pulled his black SUV onto the dirt track at Old Mill Road at 10 in the morning, and he walked the 50 yards to the ice house, and he knocked on the outer door. I was inside in the front section, sitting on the camp chair, having a second cup of coffee with Marjorie, who had come out to keep me company because we had both expected Garrett within the week. I opened the door. Garrett was wearing the charcoal wool coat. He had the small polite expression on his face that he used when he was about to begin a conversation he had rehearsed. "June," he said. "Garrett. May I come in?" I stepped aside. He came in. He saw Marjorie. Marjorie nodded at him without standing. Garrett glanced at her, recalibrated, and turned back to me. "I would have called," he said, "but I was already in the area. I thought I would stop by." "What can I do for you, Garrett?" He looked around the front section. He looked at the camp cot and the folding chair and the small propane heater and the boxes. He looked at the inner door at the back. He could not see from where he stood what was behind it. "June," he said. I want to be honest with you. I have heard some things. I would not raise it if I had not heard from more than one person. I have heard that there are some items on the property that may have come into your possession through the tax sale. I have heard that they may be of some value. I am not coming here to make a claim of any kind. I am coming as family, in the spirit of my father, to see if there is anything we should discuss. I sat down on the folding chair across from Marjorie. What did you hear, Garrett? I heard that an appraiser from Burlington has been out here several times. I heard there is a workshop with antique furniture. I heard there was a man here who lived on the property before the war who left some valuable things. That is all roughly correct. He looked at me. He was trying, I could tell, to read which way to take the conversation. He had not expected me to be calm. He had expected me to be defensive or evasive or anxious. Calm was a posture he had not prepared for. June, he said, I want you to know that I am not trying to take anything from you. I want you to know that. But I also want you to know that if there is a piece of my father's family history involved here, in any way, I think we have to have a conversation about it. There is no piece of your father's family history involved here, Garrett. How would you know that? Because I know who the man was who lived on this property. I know who he was to me. And I know who he was not. He was not connected to your father in any way. He was connected to my mother's family. He had been engaged to my great-aunt in Berlin in the 1930s. He kept her photographs and her family's photographs for 50 years in a sealed room in this building. The things in this building belonged to him, and through him to my great-aunt, and through her to my grandmother, who was my great-aunt's older sister, and through her to me, who am her granddaughter. He looked at me for a long moment. I had no idea about any of this, he said. No, you would not have. It is not your family. It has never been your family. June. Garrett. You are upset. I am not upset. I am being clear. I want to be very clear with you because we have had 27 years of conversations that were not clear, in which I let you assume things that were not true, and you let me believe things that were not true, and we have both ended up in a place we should not be. I want this conversation to be different. He did not say anything. I went on. There is a declaration of intent on file at the Caledonia County Clerk's office, dated August 1971, signed by the man who owned this property before the county took it on the tax rolls. The declaration states that the contents of the workshop on this parcel were always intended to pass to the descendants of my grandmother Hannah Lieberman. I am one of those descendants. I am, in fact, the only one of those descendants who has come to this parcel. The contents of the workshop are mine by the tax sale and by the declaration both. There is no claim available. There is no conversation to have. I am not making a claim. You came out here on a Saturday morning to make a claim, Garrett. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his charcoal wool coat. He did not respond. He had been caught, in the small clean way a man like Garrett is rarely caught, by a sentence that named what he had been doing. Marjorie spoke from her chair, without standing. Mr. Hadley, she said in her town clerk voice, I think Mrs. Hadley has been clear. He looked at her. He looked at me. He took his hands out of his pockets. He nodded once. All right, he said. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the latch. June, he said. He turned back. He looked for a moment like a man who was about to apologize. Then the moment passed and he did not. He had not, in his life, learned how to apologize to me. He was not going to learn how on a Saturday morning in November. I will go, he said. Yes. He went. I locked the outer door behind him. Marjorie poured me a second cup of coffee from the thermos. We sat in the front section in the quiet. Outside, his black SUV started and turned and drove back down the dirt track to the county road. Well, Marjorie said. Well. He will not come back. No, he will not. You handled that, June. I had practice. I sold the secretary desk in December to the collector in Connecticut for the offered price. I sold the Stanley Bedrock planes in January. I sold the side chairs and the long chest and the wardrobe in February through the Boston auction house for a combined $91,000 after commissions. I did not sell the cedar chest. I did not sell the writing slope. I did not sell the photographs. I did not sell the journal. I donated the photographs and the journal and the letters and the Personal effects in March to the Leo Beck Institute in New York, with a small endowment from the auction proceeds to establish a folder in their archive under Esther Lieberman's name. The institute sent 2 researchers to Vermont in April to collect the materials in person. They were careful with them. They thanked me in a letter that I have kept. I used part of the proceeds to do the work on the ice house. The roof was replaced in May. A small extension was built off the south wall to add a kitchen and a bathroom, with the original stone walls preserved and visible from the inside. A well was drilled in June. A septic system was installed in July. By August, 15 months after I had bid $6 at the tax sale, the building was a small year-round house, modest and well-built and entirely my own. The workshop room I kept. I cleared it out, after the appraised pieces had gone to their buyers. I cleaned the workbench. I kept the tools that were left, the small marking gauges and the bevel squares that Doug had said were of value mostly as part of an intact shop, because I did not have the heart to break them up, and because I had decided in the late winter that I wanted to learn to use them. Caleb Bennett's father, who had retired from the hardware store in 2008 and who was 83 years old and who had built 3 boats by hand in his life, agreed to teach me, one Tuesday afternoon a month, the basics of hand tool woodworking. I was 70 years old. I would not become a master. I would learn enough to make small things. I would learn enough to use the workbench Otto Stein had used for 30 years. And to keep the room a working room rather than a museum. In the back of the workshop on the west wall, where the cedar chest had stood, I put a small framed photograph. It was a copy of the photograph from May of 1930. Otto and Esther in front of the wooden gate in Berlin, in the spring of the year before everything began to change. Below the photograph I had a small plaque made, with 2 names on it, Otto Stein, Esther Lieberman. That is all the plaque says. The descendants of Hannah Lieberman are now one person, since my mother and her brother are both gone and my own marriage to Walter produced no children. I am the entire branch of the family that came through Hannah and survived. When I am gone, there will be no descendants. I have made provision in my own will, with Carol Brennan, that the small house on Old Mill Road and the half-acre and what remains in the workshop and the small endowment I have set aside for upkeep will pass, on my death, to the Leo Beck Institute, to be sold or maintained or transferred at their discretion, with a single condition. The photograph on the west wall of the workshop, and the plaque beneath it, must remain in place for as long as the building stands. Carol thought that was sentimental. She drafted the clause anyway. I am writing this on a March afternoon, 2.5 years after I bid $6 on the parcel at the tax sale at the Northbridge Town Hall. The light through the south window of the small kitchen extension is the light I have come to know as my own light. The propane heater is no longer needed, because the house has insulation now, and a small wood stove that vents through the original brick chimney from the cottage foundation, which I had a mason restore in the spring. Marjorie comes for dinner once a week. Carol comes for dinner once a month. Caleb's father comes on Tuesdays for the woodworking lesson and stays for tea afterward. Garrett has not contacted me. I have not contacted him. I do not think about him often. The house on Ashfield Road sold in February of last year, to a young couple from Boston who, by all accounts I have heard, are doing well in it. I am glad. The house was a good house. It deserved to belong to people who would belong to it. I think about Otto Stein every day. I think about him in the workshop in the mornings, when I open the inner door and the air that comes out is the same air that came out when I opened it for the first time, the dry steady air of a room that has been kept by stone walls and patience. I think about him when I sit at the workbench and try to cut a dovetail and fail and try again. I think about him on the afternoons when the light through the high western window falls in a particular way on the place where the cedar chest used to stand. He was not my husband. He was not my father. He was, in the small specific way of a man I had never met who had loved a woman I had never met, my keeper. He had kept, for 50 years in a sealed stone room, the memory of my great-aunt and the photographs of my grandmother and the small testament of his own life, against the day that someone of their blood would come to find it. I had come. I had not known I was coming. I had been pushed out of a house I had thought was mine, by a stepson I had thought I understood, with $18,000 and a Subaru and a list of things I owned in the world. A friend at the town clerk's office had told me there was a parcel for sale for $3. I had bid $6. I had walked into a stone building on a dirt track, and unlocked a door I had not known was there. I had found him. He had been waiting for me, although neither of us had known it, since August of 1971, when he had written the last entry in his journal and sealed the inner room and walked out of the workshop for the last time. I had walked in 53 years later, on a Saturday morning in late September, with a pair of bolt cutters and a flashlight, and I had opened his door. A woman of 70 can be evicted from a house she has lived in for 27 years. A woman of 70 can be told that the life she has built has not, in the documents, been hers. A woman of 70 can sit at a kitchen table on a Friday afternoon with $18,000 to her name and no place to go. She can also, on a Saturday morning, bid $6 on a piece of land at the back of a county road, and find at the end of the dirt track a building that has been waiting for her. She can find in the building a room that has been sealed against the day she would come. She can find in the room a chest that has been holding her family's photographs for 50 years. She can find in the chest the name her mother could not say. She can find in a drawer of a desk built for her by a man she has never met a card that says, "In advance." That is what I found. That is what was in the ice house. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.